Wow, so I'm overwhelmed not only by the size of the folks, the size of the crowd we have tonight, but also by how compliant you are. Normally, this is like a lot more difficult to kind of corral folks. Hey, thank you so much for coming. My name is Walt Cooper. I have the honor and the pleasure of chairing IRAP's board, and of course welcoming you all tonight as well. Whether you are someone who is deeply immersed in refugee issues, or whether this is something new, I think you're going to learn something tonight, and I think you're going to be really entertained and impressed. Kelly knows what I'm talking. Exactly. I want to start first off by thanking the co-hosts and the folks who have brought you all here tonight. So my friend Joy's son and her sister Tammy's son have been gracious enough to co-host, and then of course the founder of All Turtles and our literal host here in the space, Phil Libin. I'm going to hand things over to Phil here, who has a really terrific connection to this issue in particular, and I think a few words to share with you. So thanks, Phil.
Thank you. By the way, Walt didn't really introduce himself, but he's just about the most interesting person that I've met. So afterwards, you guys should talk and ask Walt what his story is, because it's cooler than you think. I didn't mean it as a direct insult. It's just more interesting. Let's just say he's more interesting than I am. Okay, so thank you for coming. This is actually kind of our first thing like this that we've ever done. I'm grateful for the opportunity to co-host. Those of you who know me at all, I'm not a political person. I kind of go out of my way to never say anything political. I try very hard to not be partisan. A, because it's usually bad business, and B, because I just don't really care that much about most things. But I do care about this issue, and I didn't even realize it until Trump got elected and started fucking around with things. I didn't realize that I kind of cared about this, that I cared about immigration, and that I cared about refugees in particular, and it's for the very kind of boring, prosaic reason why people care about things, which is I was a refugee myself. I came to this country officially as a refugee in 1979 with my parents from what was the Soviet Union. High-ass brought us over. And we kind of did, the full thing, renouncing citizenship in the Soviet Union, being stateless people, kind of working through the railroad to get here, having a lot of assistance to actually settle in the country, get jobs, do all of that kind of thing. And I realized that the fact that America, the fact that the U.S. admits has a pretty inefficient immigration system where we're not really looking for immigrants that are the most likely to be economically productive, but we kind of take people based on need, is one of the things that I really like about this country. It always made me feel like this was a show of strength, that well, sure, Canada can have an efficient, well thought out system bringing them the most economically beneficent immigrants, but that's because, they're a small state. And we're the US, we have the confidence and the strength to take people without asking questions about, are you going to be useful? I thought that was a great asset. It made me feel proud and more comfortable in this country, because I thought I was joining a country that was strong enough and confident enough to take everyone, or at least to take everyone based on their need, and who's got more need than actual refugees who are leaving a pretty bad situation and coming here. And I so took this for granted, this confidence that I had in the country, that I didn't even realize it until it started being questioned a few months ago by Trump. It never even occurred to me that this was a thing that I cared about. And so I've been thinking about this issue for a little bit, just recently. And it's interesting how different the experience of refugees is now from our experience, because in many ways there was a lot of similarities. We came over in 1979, my parents and I fleeing a country that was back then our ideological enemy, and we were welcomed. We were welcomed by everyone politically, on all sides of the political spectrum in 1979 and 1980. If you can escape from the Soviet Union, from the evils of communism, and you made it here, like everyone wanted you to be here. The Democrats did, the Republicans did. There was not a whole lot of opposition to people saying, keep these people out. And that's really shifted. And I wonder why. And I think some of that fault may actually lie with institutions on the left. Because one of the things that was different from us, that we had to do differently, was we were seen as coming from this very dangerous regime and ideology, but we were very eager to blend in. And back then, in the late 70s, like what was expected of us was this melting pot idea, that everyone just sort of shows up here and becomes American. That's changed, and I think it's changed in a positive way in general, but I think the melting pot idea has kind of disappeared, maybe for good reason, to be replaced with more ideas of sharper diversity, of people preserving their culture, because living in a society that has multiple very visible cultures is a richer experience. But maybe that's one of the reasons why culturally there is more opposition now, because people aren't expected to blend in. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. It's, I think, one of the things that's interesting to talk through. Other things, there's actually lots of similarities. Like my parents or I would not have passed any kind of test or point system for people that are desirable to be here. None of us spoke English at all. None of us had any Nobel Prizes or Olympic medals. I still don't have any, much to my great shame. My parents didn't have STEM degrees of any kind. They were both musicians. They're both professional musicians. So this was like, we would have gotten nothing on any kind of point system. It was even worse than that. As part of the process of getting into the country, so we had to renounce our citizenship in the Soviet Union, and then we went to Austria for like processing, and then asked for political asylum, refugee status in the US, and then went to Italy for 3 or 4 months to just sort of park there while paperwork was processed. And in that process, one of the things the US asked is for if there's any outstanding health issues with anyone in the family. And my mom, who I think meant well, and was also like super honest about everything, kind of thought, well, the boy gets crippling headaches from time to time. Maybe I should put that down on the form. So when like in the section for health issues, she's like, well, and our 7-year-old son occasionally gets like debilitating crippling headaches. And then that delayed the process by like 2 months, because now we had to like wait in line for me to be examined thoroughly by the Italian medical system in 1979. 2 months later, we got an appointment, went to a doctor's office, waited for 6 hours to see the doctor, who then literally, and I still remember this, looked at me, took my temperature, and signed something, and then it was okay. So when we were admitted to the US, not only were we not English speaking, not economically useful, no useful skills, no gold medals or Nobel Prizes, but theoretically there was like a potentially important undiagnosed long-term medical condition with the kid, and still they took us. So this was a really amazing thing, and I am really pissed to see it squandered, and to see this confidence and strength we had as a country squandered, where now we're afraid of refugees. And we're talking about how people who come here ought to be more directly useful, and this to me is turning us into a lesser country. So I care about this issue, and I was very happy to hear about IRAP and about the work that they're doing, and glad that you guys get a chance to hear from them and learn learn what they're up to. So I'm going to turn it over to Becca Heller, who is the co-founder of IRAP. She started it in 2008. I guess 10-year anniversary is coming up soon, if we all make it that far. Yeah. 2008, out of Yale Law School, and the idea was to provide a legal framework, a set of human rights and legal framework for refugees. They have provided legal assistance to more than 20,000 people. They've resettled thousands of people. They've worked to pass 8 pieces of legislation through Congress, back when that was a useful branch of government that passed legislation. And that legislation has actually paved the way for more than 160,000 people to be resettled, to get visas, to get status. And that work really continues. As some of you know, there's a big Supreme Court case pending, because Congress may have stopped doing stuff, but hopefully the court still does stuff. So there's a big Supreme Court case pending, which we're very actively involved in, and other stuff, and we'll get Becca to come up and talk about that. So please welcome Becca Heller.
Thanks so much for the rousing, thought-provoking introduction, and also for taking all of my finale statistics away from me, such that I'm going to need to find a good way to, you're going to use a mic as your rejoinder? Okay. It's just echoing.
I was given those stats to say verbatim, this is how you introduce Becca.
You did a great job.
So, and I was told that you would be pissed if I got any of those numbers wrong.
You got them all correct.
All right, thank you.
I'm super happy to be here. I'm really grateful to Walt and Joy and Tammy and Phil for hosting. I'm grateful to all of you for coming. It's an interesting time to be doing refugee work. I'm going to talk a little bit about what got me started in this work, how things have changed a little bit since, say, January 20th, to pick a random date, and what we're up to now. Then Srosh, who's one of our former clients, is going to speak about his experience navigating the special immigrant visa system, and then we'll take questions, which hopefully people will have, because that's the most interesting part for me, because I've heard myself talk before. So I, as Phil mentioned, kind of accidentally started this organization while I was a law student. In the summer of 2008, I got a fellowship from Yale Law School to go do an internship in Israel. And long story short, the NGO I was at just didn't have enough for me to do. And I am really obsessed with efficiency and really hate wasting my time, partially because we're all going to die, I guess, unless, you know, all turtles can do something. What's your the turtles can do something about it? Or like the singularity takes over and the machines live past us, which I've been asking everyone in this room about. I'm like, oh, you do artificial intelligence? Like, is the singularity coming? The answers were not reassuring. So I was sitting in this air-conditioned office in Tel Aviv, just like watching Mad Men. And at the time, there had only been 2 seasons, so I ran out of episodes pretty quickly. And then I was just like, what am I doing here? And I kept hearing about all of these Iraqi refugees in Jordan. And while IRAP we consider ourselves bipartisan, we've taken a pretty staunch anti-Trump stance because you can't be neutral on a moving presidency. But we work really closely with members on sort of all sides of the aisle and endorse none. Personally, I'm quite political, which may stem from growing up here. But I had some sort of mixed feelings about the role that the U.S. had played in the displacement of Iraqi refugees. And I felt like as long as I wasn't doing anything else and there was no other video of John Hamm available to me, I might as well go to Jordan and meet with some refugees and try to sort of better understand the humanitarian fallout of my country's foreign policy. Luckily, we don't have a foreign policy anymore, so that's no longer necessary. So I emailed everyone that I could think of, and through a very attenuated series of people, I ended up being able to go to Amman and meet with 6 refugee families. And I had spent a couple years in sub-Saharan Africa prior to law school, so I was prepared for, you know, like humanitarian crises. I thought people would be hungry, that they would have, you said fuck, so I can say this, that they would have shitty housing, that they wouldn't be able to go to school or have access to healthcare. And those things were all true. But what really surprised me is that all 6 families I met with essentially independently identified their biggest problem as essentially legal. I don't know if anyone in this room knows the song Closing Time by Semisonic, but yeah, it has this line that I think, like, if you grew up in the 90s, which I did, sort of perfectly epitomizes the refugee plight, which is you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. And everyone's like, yeah, Semisonic. And that's what was happening to people. They had all fled Iraq because something really fucking terrible had happened to them. And they were in Jordan, but there was no way for them to rebuild new lives. And they had to navigate this like crazy, bureaucratic, nonsensical legal system to try to get any kind of legal status or to get out. And when you said that your mom admitted that you had, I don't know if you would call them, I'm not a doctor, but I hear crippling headaches and I think migraines, and that it only delayed you for 2 months, like that's, like, no offense, that's nothing. Like, I just, like, like now if you have a baby, it delays you for like 2 years because you literally have to go physically present the baby to someone from Washington, D.C. who comes to Jordan to make sure the baby has the same skin color as you and you're not just trying to like smuggle another kid into the country. So like don't reproduce if you're trying to resettle as a refugee because it'll slow you down. And everyone I met with was just in, you know, a variety of really dire circumstances that we can all imagine and have probably heard about and that I don't need to belabor. But all of them believed that they were on this wait list. And that if they could just like hang in there long enough, they would eventually get a call, like, oh, my neighbor last week got a call and he got on a plane to Canada and now he's fine, and they would be able to leave and get resettled. So at the end of the week, I felt like at the very least I could try to figure out how long the wait list was and then get back to people and say, if you can hang in there for another 6 months, 12 months, a year and a half, you'll be okay. And I think that the merit-based arguments about immigration are actually kind of interesting because to me, like, immigrants are very self-selecting to begin with, right? Like, if you talk about, I mean, we're in the Bay Area, so like, let's talk about entrepreneurship, right? Like, someone came to your house and killed someone in your family, threatened you with death, then you escaped from a war zone, got to a neighboring country, navigated a crazy-ass bureaucracy, hung out in Italy for a few months, managed to get here and start over. Like, if that isn't entrepreneurship, I just don't know what is. So when our politicians talk about how like admitting people based on need is somehow like diametrically opposed to admitting them based on merit, I just think that's total bullshit. And so I felt like armed with the correct information about like if you can just scrape by for 8 or 12 months or a year and a half, refugees who I think are really more survivors than they are victims could at least like make a plan, and that the US and the UN were doing them a disservice by withholding information from them. So I finagled this meeting with the US Embassy by faking a visa issue with my passport because the only people who actually answer the phone at the US Embassy in Amman are consular services for US citizens. And then this poor consular services officer had to I'm like, oh, I'm a Yale law student, and I'm like researching like this refugee situation you guys have, and she's like, let me get you someone from public affairs. And they got the UN on the phone, and I was asking them questions, and they were explaining this system to me that made no sense. In retrospect, it turns out it's because it's a nonsensical system. And at the end, I was like, that's all great. Can you tell me how long the wait list is? And they said, what wait list? There is no wait list. And I've thought about this a lot, not just because it's a really ideal metaphor for like stump speeches, but because I do not think that the wait list was like a nefariously propagated rumor by the US and the UN to placate people. I think that it was a rumor that came out of the refugee community itself. Because I think if you live at the bottom of a deep, dark hole, you have to believe that there's some kind of light at the top in order to keep getting out of bed every morning. And the fact that the best beacon of hope that the community could come up with was the epitome of an inefficient and dysfunctional bureaucracy struck me as so tragic that I felt compelled to try to do something about it. So I went back to school, and myself and another student, John Feiner, which is actually how I know Walt, John Feiner went on to be John Kerry's chief of staff. So I always like to joke that if you co-found IRAP, you can take 2 divergent career paths, one of which is running IRAP and one of which is running the State Department. And who won, really? Because only one of us is still in our job. I hope he watches this. We started this as a student organization at Yale. Feiner's interest in it was that he had been a reporter for the Washington Post embedded with US troops in Fallujah, and there was a special program for US-affiliated Iraqis and also Afghans, which Srosh will talk about, who are in danger because of their work to get out, and Feiner couldn't get any of his fixers through this program. And he's too outwardly modest to put it this way, but in my explication of Feiner's inner monologue, he's like, I'm like a Rhodes Scholar from Harvard, I'm at Yale Law School, and I can't figure out this program, not to mention I'm a native English speaker. Like, how are you supposed to do this if you're in hiding in Fallujah? So we co-founded this organization and started working on these cases. Our supervising professor, Mike Wishney, who I'm obsessed with and want to be, and there's going to be an article in The Guardian next week quoting me saying that, and it's going to be embarrassing. called us into his office one day and he said, "You guys aren't working on cases, are you?" And we were like pretty dumb, but not totally dumb. So we were sort of like, "That's an interesting question, Mike. Like, why do you ask?" And he said, "Because that's illegal, because you're not lawyers. And we call that the unauthorized practice of law." And we're like, "Good thing we're not doing it." And then Finer and I leave the room and we're just like, fuck, like we have to find some lawyers. And then we thought, well, law firms come here and try to recruit all the time. Why don't we just call them up and say, "Hey, do you want to sink your claws into some Yale law students? If you take on these cases pro bono, we'll match you with students." And that's the model we still use. So today we have more than 3,000 law students matched with pro bono attorneys working on cases for about 3,000 individuals. We have chapters at 29 law schools in the US and Canada. They're partnered with more than 85 multinational law firms. We also work with the in-house counsel at 9 multinational corporations, like really big ones, like Starbucks and like Microsoft and stuff. I know that I'm doing Seattle. There should be one in San Francisco, but there's not yet. Dropbox. Levi's. You know who you are, corporations. And we've been able to provide legal assistance to over 20,000 people trying to navigate this process. Our model is to try to combine direct legal aid with systemic advocacy, because I want to be able to help as many people as possible and then use what I learned from that to help as many people as possible. So our legislative advocacy and our litigation stems directly from our legal work. We have passed 8 pieces of congressional legislation, although Congress hasn't been totally inactive because 2 of them were this year. We added 6,500 visas for Afghan nationals whose lives are at risk because of their service to the US. That doesn't count their family members. The average family multiplier is about 3.7, so we got passage from Afghanistan to the US for about 20,000 people this year. Congress did that. And for those of you keeping track at home, that's exactly 2 more pieces of legislation than President Trump has passed this year. So things are sort of like humming along. Trump gets elected president. We all like panic and enter into a deep depression. We come out of it and start plotting. January 20th rolls around. We're like, we have this army of lawyers that wants to fight for refugees, particularly refugees from the Middle East. What are things that we can do with them? And President Trump was nice enough to answer that question for us right away. So he was inaugurated on Friday, January 20th. He took the weekend off to play golf, and generally I think to obfuscate about what his actual agenda was going to be. Then on Monday, someone leaked me a draft of the first Muslim ban. It was literally someone had taken a photo of the text on a desktop computer and sent it to a reporter who had sent it to us to say, like, "Can you explain to me what this means?" And I was like, "Yes, this means they're banning people from 7 Muslim countries and all Syrian refugees." And so we called all of our clients who had valid visas at the time and we said, "Get on a plane." Right? The US is closing for business, get on a plane. We raise money from law firms to cover their plane tickets. And we focus on particularly vulnerable cases, again, which I think isn't mutually exclusive with merit-based, but I think our interest is in if there's a limited number of slots, let's make sure they go to women at risk, US allies, LGBTI individuals, children with medical issues, which could include crippling headaches. Etc. So we actually have a huge number of transgender cases, and we had one of them arriving into LAX that Wednesday, and the difficulty with transgender cases traveling is that their identity documents don't match their identity. So she was traveling on a passport that had a different name for her and said that she was a man. And normally I worry about that with like exiting someplace like Saudi Arabia. But in this case, I was really worried that if the travel ban was signed while she was in the air, that she wouldn't be permitted to enter. So we quietly sent a lawyer to just like hang out at arrivals at LAX, and she got in okay, you know, inshallah. And I was G-chatting, and I looked this up later because everyone's like, how did it happen? And I was like, I don't remember. And then thankfully the cloud archives every single thing we say ever. And so that night I was G-chatting with Betsy Fisher, our policy director, and we'll call her Katie. And I was like, thank goodness, like, Katie arrived all right. And Betsy's like, yeah, it's really good that the band didn't come down today. I was like, I know, because Katie made it end. And Betsy was like, yes, and the other 60 refugees that would have been on that plane, because they fly in groups. And then I had this like holy shit moment of, at whatever point this thing gets signed, which we know will be this week, there will be thousands of people in the air who had legal permission to enter the US at the time that their flight took off, but by the time they landed were illegal immigrants to the US, and no one knows what the fuck is gonna happen to them. So we put out a call to our network of lawyers and we said, go to the airport. Like, here's a template habeas petition, here's some know your rights information, go to the airport. And we organized, you probably heard about maybe you did or maybe you didn't, but that was us, the lawyers who went to the airport that weekend. And the actual executive order was signed at 4:30 p.m. on Friday, January 27th. And we had been tracking the arrivals of our clients. And I put my daughter to bed at 8 o'clock. And then at 8:30, I was into a few drinks, which I regretted immensely for the rest of the weekend. And I got a call that 2 of our clients had been detained at JFK, and that they were detained with a bunch of other people, and that they had all been handcuffed. And I called a friend of mine who's actually a litigator, and I was like, what do we file? And he said, we need to file a petition for a writ of habeas corpus, which this is not the interesting part, but you should all know this. It is the most important right that you have as anyone in the US. You cannot be held without any procedure. They cannot turn airports into a black site. It doesn't matter if you're documented or illegal or not. And we called Mike Wishney, who came up earlier, who I'm obsessed with. And he said, why not make it a class action and say, no one is allowed to be detained under this executive order anywhere in the country. So we stayed up all night and we filed it at 5:30 a.m. the next morning because we wanted to make sure it was on file before any international flights departed, because we didn't want them to deport anybody. We got an emergency hearing at 7:30 that night, and by 8:30 we had won a court case that resulted in the release of 2,100 people who had been detained at airports all over the US, saying that the travel ban was illegal. So for those of you who like math, it took us 28 hours. And I really wanted to beat that record when the second travel ban came out. So that time we were actually able to file and get the entire thing enjoined before it even went into effect. And we've now gone all the way to the Supreme Court several times this summer. Actually, Trump versus International Refugee Assistance Project, which is the title of the last 9 months of my life.
IRAP helped them a lot. And right now, the biggest problem for them, they don't have internet. They don't have computer. They don't know how to deal with the computer. So the good thing, IRAP helped them a lot. And also, some of them, I'm helping them with their emails. I have their emails. Open their emails and answer the question from the embassy, which they got. I get contact with them like, hey, you got an email, so you need to go forward and get the next step. So I don't know, you know Nabil, I think it's one of your client. He already got the visa. So his email is with me. I'm open, open his email, try to email to IRAP, and nobody knows that. So in this case, me, you people, American people, need to help them and take them over here. They're in hell. Their life is extremely at risk over there. So that's it. If you guys have any question, believe me, I can answer you. Yeah. By the way, thank you very much for helping.
So we've got a microphone over here for any questions
Yes.
for anyone here. I will pass it along. Here we go. Hey, George.
I have a hard question. I apologize for going first. Hi, so I'm an immigrant too. I was born in Georgia. I came here on my own when I was 14. My brother followed me 4 years later. I have this view that, if someone graduates from American college, you should give them a diploma and a green card. And I wouldn't want to say no one, because we have a crazy president who says insane things, but I think most people who are for a points-based system don't couple that with a refugee question. Meaning most people, including myself, who are very strongly for a points-based system, couple it vis-a-vis the family-based immigration system, which we think is screwed up. And so that's my challenge a little bit. And what I heard
How did your brother get here?
My brother came on his own as well.
Okay.
And that's my issue. Like I came to the US in 1992. I finished an American prep school. I finished a very top American college. I founded a company in 2007, building a thing on mobile and no one else did. But I didn't get my green card until 2012 because the green card process is so ridiculous. You don't have a master's degree, it's very hard. And so the idea that there is an alternative method to that, which doesn't make any sense, it bothers me personally. And I think when they first introduced the point system in 2007, I went through it and I would have a green card right away. So it kind of made a lot more sense to me. So anyway, that's my challenge. Coupling it with refugees makes the point system look really bad, but actually, vis-a-vis what point system is trying to replace is actually potentially really good. So that's my question or comment.
So the point system is basically sort of what Phil was alluding to. There's a debate in this country right now about whether we should prioritize. There's a limited number of slots for immigrants every year. So the result is that if you are of Mexican origin, but you're a U.S. green card holder and you're applying for your parents, they're going to wait 17 years to come in because of the backlog in immigration processing. So there's an argument that says rather than prioritizing family-based petitions, we should assign points to people for certain things. So you get a point if you speak English, you get a point if you have a bachelor's degree, you get et cetera. And that when we talk about sort of a merit-based immigration system, that's what we're talking about. I'm gonna punt on your question actually, because IRAP doesn't take a position on family-based immigration petitions versus a point system. I think personally they shouldn't be mutually exclusive. I would argue that you could expand work visas to allow for a points-based system without detracting from the family system. I also think that there's a ton of studies, so I guess I'm not punting, as it turns out. I also think that there's, when you do studies of your likelihood of being economically successful, which is a lot of the argument for a point system, right, is that those are the people who are more likely to be economically successful, that the number one predictor of economic success is having a close community, and that's what family is for most people. So I also think there's a strong economic argument for preferencing family reunification over sort of a merit-based point system. But mostly I think that they shouldn't be zero-sum, and that any political debate that lines them up as opposed to each other is sort of starting us off from a really flawed framework that I reject. And that there's room in this country for people to come on merit because they'll go to prestigious schools and start companies and make the singularity come faster. And there is room in this country for people who really need a safe place to rebuild their lives, and that a balanced immigration policy that takes the various interests of our nation into account does both of those things, and that there are individuals who embody both of those things.
Great. Anyone else?
Hi. I have a question about, I'm not sure exactly how to phrase this, but the chaos of the news system versus the need for public support behind where you guys are coming from with the impending Supreme Court case. So you have the first travel ban happen, everyone rushes to the airports, you have a massive public outcry, kind of the second announcement, there's a little bit less, and I would argue that, or I would assume that most people don't even know there's a Supreme Court case coming, right? So how much do you, IRAP and the kind of movement need the public to continue to scream out and yell out versus actually it's now down the legal system and you need to just kind of heads down there?
I think we really need both. I think for me, my approach to activism, for lack of a better word, is just very practical. So I've thought a lot about how did we generate that public outcry the first weekend, and I think there are a lot of factors that we just aren't going to be able to repeat. I think the fact that it was 7 days after the Women's March was a huge factor. I think all these people marched that Saturday or Sunday, I forget what it was, and then there was the news articles were all like, well, now what? And then there was a now what. I also think they were smarter in the second and third iterations of the travel bans where they said if you already have a visa, that visa is still valid. So it didn't lead to this like chaotic system of turning airports into black sites. So it's harder to find that like public rallying moment. And I think that we thought about this when the second ban came out, like, should we try to organize protests? And I ultimately felt that we shouldn't because I felt like they would only be compared to the first weekend. The same way that like when the Women's March organizers tried to do something on tax day, like even though hundreds of thousands of people marched, all of the headlines were like way fewer people marched than in January, and it's like, well, this was counterproductive. That said, while I don't know that like a huge protest is gonna be helpful, like what I always ask is for people to just keep paying attention. Because I think that this is an administration and the alt-right movement generally is really good at sort of this like, hey, look over there, right? Oh, is there a Russia investigation? No, we're bombing North Korea, right? And it's been really difficult to sort of get salience for anything in earned media. So we're like talking to Hollywood actually about like a television show about refugees because we're starting to think about sort of other mechanisms for getting refugee awareness into the public consciousness because I just think that like no news penetrates for more than like a day or two because every day is crazier than the day before and that's deliberate and that the way to kind of resist that is not so much to go and protest but to continue to pay attention. Just like set a Google alert for US refugee admissions and read the digest.
So I actually have a question for Srosh. So you said that while you were serving, the U.S. military in Afghanistan kind of promised to people in your position that they would come over. I wonder, like, what form did those promises take? Who said what? What's documented? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, the first time that the United States entered to Afghanistan and people start helping them, and United States promised them, like, if your life is at risk in future, we're gonna be responsible, like maybe to secure your country or maybe take you out from the country. So they already promised, that was, I think, 2003. During the situation and during the year, like the situation is getting worse and the war never ends. So that's why people, they lost lots of linguists over there. They get killed in their houses. They get killed in the street. So then people applied for visas. That was, I think, 2007. That was Bush administration. So he signed a law to give them visa for those people working with the Americans. 2008, the linguists start coming to United States. Till now, they're coming by different process which they established, but the process is really hard for them. It takes time. They do the background check. Those takes time. Like each step, it takes like a month. Years, believe me, more than 2 years. I know some of them still waiting for more than 8 years, the linguists. I know some of them still waiting for 3 years. Lots of them working more than 2-3 years with the United States military. So something is wrong with the process because they're not the threat for the United States government. They already did the test. They help American in battlefield for years. So I don't know, somehow most of them, they get rejected from the United States government. Okay, we are not going to give you visa for what? For you failed that, I don't know what you call the lie detector or something?
Yeah,
like, yeah, polygraph, which does not make sense. You believe in a machine called polygraph, but you don't believe the guy which work for you for years. This is your soldier. You're going to leave your soldier back over there. This does not make sense. And it's not a human being threat against those people. We need them to bring them over here. We need to fight. And I want from American people, you know better than anyone else. You can feel their situation. They can't go out. They don't have any job right now. People hate them because you work with Americans, with the foreigners. They see us as a spy. So life is really hard for those people still in Afghanistan and Iraq. So please help them and bring them over here. Change the system. The system is not working. And by your hard working, by your sound, probably the government gonna change the system. Thank you very much.
I'll just add two things to that really quickly. One is a fun science and technology fact, which is that polygraphs are actually not admissible as evidence in US court because of how unreliable they are, but we still use them to keep out Afghan interpreters from immigrating to the US. And two is that I suspect that there may be a big lawsuit coming really soon saying that this visa program needs to move faster.
Yeah, I just personally wanted to add a quick word to what Srosh had to say. So my initial connection to IRAP stems from the 15 years I spent as an Army Special Forces officer, during which I had a lot of experiences that brought me very close to the Iraqi and Afghan brothers that I worked with. One of the notions that we kind of hold most sacred in the military is this notion that we won't leave our comrades behind. And there's no like sort of asterisk or caveat in there that says like, well, that refers specifically to the Americans. The guys who work with us and women who work with us, like Srosh, they're not the hired help. I mean, they're our brothers too. And the idea that so many of them have in fact been left behind kind of, I don't know, adds to the, I don't know, the kind of psychic burden that a lot of us carry around from the experience as a whole. So when we are able to bring guys like Srosh back, man, it feels like a weight lifted. And so, it's awesome. Thanks.
You've quite rightly focused in the last 9 months on Trump v. IRAP. What do we not know? What is Trump gonna do next in this area that people aren't thinking about?
Do you want to turn off the video recorder?
Wouldn't you give an answer for the record, and then we'll take one?
He's not going to stop, right? I mean, I think, what? No, I'll give an answer for the record, and then
Please.
if you want to turn it off, I'll give some more information. I think that what you've seen is someone who really doesn't like to lose, and who has lost pretty much his entire policy agenda battle, with the exception of immigration and possibly climate change. Although I heard maybe we didn't pull out of Paris, as it turns out. I think I saw a tweet about that. I'm a little confused. But I think that like every time something else stalls out on the agenda, or like Mueller subpoenas someone else from the White House, it corresponds with a crackdown on immigration. Like you can literally map it out of like, oh, we pulled temporary protected status for Sudanese people, like right after he screwed up his speech to the UN. You know what I mean? So I think that the other is always a convenient target. Historically, like most tyrants have utilized a scapegoat. to try to sort of rally people together around a message of hate and anger. And I think that as his legislative agenda continues to stall, because it doesn't look that good for this tax reform package, and he already compromised on the debt ceiling, like I think you're just gonna see him, you know, it's the executive branch has a huge amount of control over immigration. We would argue that that control doesn't outstrip the parameters of the Constitution, which is why we're in court all the time. But, you know, I think that it's a really convenient punching bag for him to sort of dog whistle at his base at the expense of a lot of people's lives. So I would expect that, like, as the rest of the agenda continues to get stalled, the rhetoric and the abuse and violence targeting immigrants, both in this country and trying to come to this country, is only going to escalate.
Yeah, let's do the off-the-record answer maybe when we're done. Anyone else have on-the-record questions?
What can non-lawyers do to help?
Give us money.
Non-lawyers have money?
I don't know. I'm a lawyer without money. No, there's a bunch of things you could do. I mean, I think, like, for one thing, stepping back a bit from the refugee issue and just thinking about sort of the apocalyptic nature of these times in general, like, I think that you should figure out, like, whatever issue it is that you care about, whether it's this issue or some other one, and just, like, not get distracted. Like, I think that's the biggest thing. Like, I know for me, a lot of the, like, mental work I did with myself between, like, November 10th and January 19th was just, like, crazy shit is gonna go down. Your lane is refugees, right? Like, if you chase after Jeff Sessions to me is the most dangerous thing that has happened to this country in the last, like, 9 months, arguably. But, I mean, I'm also a lawyer, so, but I think, whatever it is that you want to throw down on against, like, the forces that be, I think you just have to pick. You have to pick a way to throw down on it that is meaningful to you. So, like, I think it's a really personal question of, like, when you do activism or whatever label, like, do you like to write? Do you like to speak? Do you like to do philanthropy? Whatever it is, like, you can write op-eds, you can have house parties, you know, you can organize rallies, you can attend stuff, you can donate to stuff, like, pick the issue you care about and the thing that you like to do and combine those things and don't fucking get distracted. Period.
Maybe we'll do, yeah. Let's maybe do one or two more questions because I want to leave some time for people to just mingle and chat. So any other questions here?
Putting aside the refugee component, like, is there like a specific policy issue around immigration that we should all, is like, hey, this is the most broken part of the system? Like, to me, there's like a really interesting debate on the merit-based versus need-based, but, like, is there broadly just like, hey, this thing, if we fix this would improve a lot, or is it just kind of a really complicated mess?
So the answer to both is yes. So, you know, under the previous administration, which is the only other administration that I have done this work under, so it's my only basis of comparison, our MO around policy advocacy was this sort of, like, technical legal geek, like, we've walked through the system 3,000 times and we really like to read, like, 8 CFR 252B, and we have this idea that is, like, costs nothing, and if you do it, will allow, like, X thousand more people to get into the country. And there were actually a lot of things like that. So one example is that to apply for a special immigrant visa used to require sending an original signature to Nebraska, which, like, put your life in danger, right? Because all the mail is going out of Afghanistan is getting read. So the last thing you want to do is, like, put a bunch of evidence that you worked for the US military in an envelope with your home address, your fingerprints, and your wet signature on it and send it to Nebraska. So we went to the State Department and we're like, hey, why are you requiring this? And they're like, oh, it's for security reasons. And we're like, okay, but you're fingerprinting and retinal scanning everyone, right? And they're like, yes. And we're like, so is a wet signature really adding more than a scan signature, and we got rid of that requirement, and the number of visa applications increased exponentially. So I think there's like a lot of noodling to be done with just like stupid technical detail. Like the refugee processing system around the globe hasn't been updated since 1951. And there's been some improvements that I think that we could be taking advantage of. Like the Department of Homeland Security under Obama, like 2 years ago, was like, oh, we should bring in some people who understand technology to see if we can like make it. They literally had a tech team of just like random people from the Bay Area who came in new tech to tell them things like, you should have your files be electronic instead of paper. That was literally one of them. They made their files electronic. It's the government. Like it makes me kind of an anarchist, honestly, or a libertarian, but that's a separate. But I think it's a really different environment now where there just like isn't any appetite for that kind of thing. Like the way that laws actually get noodled about with and changed is that like the people enforcing the laws like give enough of a shit that they want them to be better. And a lot of those people are still in the agencies, but they've become completely disempowered. And I think we're in this fight that's just way more existential. And that if I were gonna say what's the fundamental policy question, it would be, are we a country that will take in people seeking refuge or not?
Okay, last question. Anyone have a question? Because I have one if no one does. Awesome. Okay. When I talked in the beginning, I said one difference from our experience was very much that we were welcomed. Like 100% of the challenge was outside of the U.S. Once we kind of got here, politically, like Republicans wanted us here, Democrats wanted us here, everyone wanted us here. There was like a unification around that we were part of this fortunate group of people that were welcomed here. How do we try to restore that, at least some of that? It can't, there still has to be a majority of people here with goodwill that want to do this. What went wrong, and how can we get back to this admitting people who truly are refugees to be something that it has bipartisan support?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is to correct the historical record a little bit. Like, I think you were welcomed in part because you fleeing was weakening our enemy.
But in a similar way, right? This is like we were fleeing the country's current enemy, and current refugees, people fleeing Syria are fleeing ISIS, right?
Or Bashar al-Assad, right. I think we're losing the narrative debate on that. I think that it's really, actually just wrote an essay for foreign policy where I went on this rant about how you can't make an articulate pro-refugee argument in 140 characters, but it's really easy to say refugees are terrorists and still have 70 characters left. I think that because the narrative of they're the other terrorists, be afraid, is so much more salient than the narrative of the day that the first travel ban came out, ISIS tweeted and called it the blessed ban. They said it was the best thing for recruitment that had ever happened to them. And there are a lot of other national security reasons why it's good to take in refugees, like the fact that they are literally sinking the infrastructure of Jordan and Turkey, who are our two biggest allies in the Middle East, and whose bases we use to fly planes out of to bomb ISIS. I also think that our failure to take refugees, especially from the Middle East, and instead to paint them as the enemy, means that our projection into the Middle East is solely militaristic. And I don't think that's a good look for us. And I think it's a really good look for our enemies. So we say Bashar al-Assad dropped a bunch of chemical weapons, and our response to that is to shoot 59 Tomahawk missiles at the same people that he dropped chemical weapons on, and we say that that's some kind of proportionate response. So I think part of it, and this isn't sort of the human feel-good grassroots answer to your question, but I think part of it is just that we need the pro-refugee folks, be it individuals in this room or the NGOs or the left or however you want to define it, need to get better at articulating the national security rationales for refugees, because I do think that that is part of why we were so willing to take a ton of people from the Soviet Union. We took 500,000 people after the Vietnam War, but we're losing the rhetorical debate. I think, obviously on a more human level, I think about my grandmother. who is like kind of a racist, but always liked all the people of color that she knew personally. And I think that that's part of it, is that someone is only the other if you don't know them. So bringing refugees into our communities, making sure that communities around the US continue to be welcoming and elevating the stories of people like Srosh. I think that the narrative around refugees has progressed somewhat. I think for a while the pro-refugee narrative was just like, they're victims and we need to help them, and like, I hate that. They're not victims, like they're survivors, and I think portraying them as such isn't useful. Then I think it sort of recently took this turn to like the Us magazine of like, refugees, they're just like us, you know, they like get gasoline and cook their kids dinner. And I think that's an effort to like make people seem like less like the other, but it's also doing refugees a disservice, because it's like, yes, they're cooking dinner in the middle of a bombed out kitchen where they still manage to get food on the table. Like, they're sort of a lot better than us. And I would like to just see it get to a point of like, refugees, they have a different background from us, but they're very welcome here because they're so interesting and entrepreneurial and exciting and tenacious, and we're really excited to have them. And I think that on a really local level, like, that begins at home. There are a ton of refugees that get resettled in the Bay Area. Hyas is still resettling refugees in the Bay Area. You can volunteer with them. You can host stuff to have friends come over and listen to refugees talk about what ballers they are. And then you can raise your voice, again, in whatever oral, written, or other method you like to try to be vocal, to say, like, we want to be a welcoming place.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Walt. This was really fascinating. One of the things that really resonated with me was Becca talking about the entrepreneurial nature of refugees. And I think that's really true. I've been trying to follow this advice again in my career, just in hiring people. There's this conventional wisdom that goes around a lot in startups, which when you're hiring people, you should be hiring for attitude, training for skill. So the attitude is just much more important than skills you can teach. So hire for attitude, train for skill, kind of common advice. And hiring people at a company is obviously very different than admitting people into our country. But I think it kind of applies in this case as well, and I can't think of a better test for attitude than someone actually, as you both said, being able to get themselves out of a horrible situation with a lot of disadvantages and through the bureaucracy and in a determined way to be a refugee. So thank you, everyone, and thank you so much.